The strangest thing about this movie for me is that as I was watching it with nary a laugh busting from my lips because I found it painfully unfunny, which is a travesty in my book because it's Melissa Joan Hart. How on earth was I not busting my gut laughing when Clarissa, or as she came to own my heart completely for 6 years of my life, Sabrina, how was I not busting a body part laughing when Melissa does have great timing as a comedian in other roles, as has been confirmed? Like I said, I found this film absolutely not funny. I kept getting the Mayday, Mayday. So the plot of this is just Stockholm syndrome, but make it Christmassy. What the hell? And yet, every time Mario Lopez came up on my screen with that dimple, I'm a preteen again, watching Saved by the Bell, swooning over AC, and there's a tiny voice at the back of my head going all, the things we do and endure for the sake of a pretty, absolutely gorgeous face. Honestly, if you told me that there existed in this world a movie that brought my two childhood loves up on my screen in a rom com that had me feeling absolutely nothing for practically the entirety of its runtime, I would have laughed in your face at the impossibility of that. But alas, Holiday in Handcuffs was almost torturous with how bored I was throughout the entire movie. And a part of me can't stop crying because before she was Trudy, she was Clarissa Explains All, and then later Sabrina Spellman. And before it was David, it was AC Slater of Saved by the Bell. And I just, how did I get into this situation where the movie's premise infuriated me and the execution bored me? Well, before I get into all of that, I would like to say a quick thank you to my lovely patrons and YouTube members whose support have been instrumental in helping me continue to make content, especially as I started doing this full time at the start of last year, which was the last time I was in paid employment. And a special shout out to Lena and Holly for their extra support. You get all the hearts and kisses too. Mwah. If you too would like to support me on Patreon or become a YouTube member to enjoy certain perks, maybe even get a shout out, the link to do so is in the description bar. Now, for those just finding my channel or content, please note that this video is part of my Romcom Ganda series, which is a video series where I do a first time watch or a rewatch of rom-coms from the late 80s to the early 2010s, just to see how well they hold up, especially with regards to things that younger me might have missed back when they initially dropped. You know, what can I glean from my more adult and slightly critical eye? As always, I'm totally down for recommendations and suggestions from you. So if you're watching this and there's a rom com you want me to add to the pot or pile, please drop them in the comments. But first, check out my Romcom Ganda playlist to see if I've already covered the movie you're about to request slash recommend first. I will leave the link to the playlist in the description bar so you can check it out. Please note that I have a style for this video series with my intro, then the synopsis of the movie, and finally my thoughts on the movie at the very end. I do put in timestamps so you can navigate this video as you so choose. And with that said, Holiday in Handcuffs opens on Trudy in her car, checking out the roads, clearly hoping to run into someone on her drive. And soon she stumbles on David, bundled up in his coat, halfway freezing to death as he tries to walk his way to freedom. Trudy suggests he gets into the car, however, pointing out that he has quite the way to go before he can get to the exit and he would most likely freeze to death on the road before that happens. After David reluctantly gets into the car, Trudy, who started off by telling the viewers that she's most certainly not crazy, which we all know is affirmation that she's most likely very much so, we go back 18 hours prior. Trudy is trying to secure a job interview that has been tossed her way by her father, and although she tries to meet the time, she unfortunately arrives late, which means that the business owner is already interviewing the second candidate for the role, effectively shutting down any chance that Trudy had of securing the job. And as if that wasn't bad enough, she arrives at her part time job as a waitress. This is probably a good time to mention that Trudy is an aspiring artist but works as a waitress on the side in order to support herself. Anyway, as I was saying, Trudy makes it to work, understandably upset about how things have turned out. Then, to make matters worse, her boyfriend, Nick, the trust fund baby, shows up at her job and proceeds to dump her publicly at that because he believes she's a mess. Trudy, as expected, spirals, especially as she recalls her mother warning her not to ruin Christmas, like way to put pressure on your kid. The meeting time for the family is fast approaching, and Trudy doesn't have anyone she can bring. Or she thinks so, at least until she spots Mario Lopez's David, who is at the diner with a ring in his pocket, hoping to propose to his high society girlfriend. Do I go into further details on the absurdity of all this in the thoughts part of this video? Yes, I do. Anyway, before David's girlfriend Jessica can show up, Trudy accosts him whilst he's on his way to the bathroom and pulls her boss's heirloom gun on David, effectively kidnapping him. He tries to escape when they get outside and she leads him to the parking lot, but he slips on a patch of ice which knocks him out and thus makes it easier for Trudy to, and I shit you not, tie him to the handles of the car with her pantyhose and blindfold him so that he can't escape. When it comes to Trudy, in truly bonkers fashion, informs him that she's taking him to the log cabin her family is staying at for the holidays so she can introduce him to her parents as her boyfriend, and runs roughshod over everything he says by creating this false identity for him that fits better with her now ex Nick than it does with David, the stranger she just kidnapped. On their way to the cabin, Trudy realizes that she's almost run out of gas, stops at a gas station, and by some miraculous twist of fate, isn't busted for the kidnapper that she is. No, instead, the gas station owner or manager, not sure which one he is, hands her a furry handcuff because he buys into her claim that she and her boyfriend are just extra frisky during the holidays. How David didn't scream bloody murder or bloody kidnap, I have no idea, whichever the case may be. Trudy brings him to the cabin and David promises to accuse her of kidnapping him the minute she really follows through on her harebrained scheme to introduce him to her family as her boyfriend. Now, you would think that that is the end of it, right? Like, here is where the truth will be revealed. Wrong. This movie thinks comedy is a great substitute for attempting to have a smidgen of logic because Trudy runs into the cabin to inform her parents that her boyfriend is outside. But get this, that they have this little game that they play whereby Nick, name of her ex boyfriend that her parents are expecting to meet, finds it hilarious to pretend that he's been kidnapped, and as such, she needs her family to go along with it. And in the most bonkers twist, they really buy this bullshit. So when David shows up to be like, yo, your daughter is absolutely out of her fucking mind and she kidnapped me to force me to play pretend as her boyfriend. Trudy's parents just burst out laughing, and I am not going to lie. If I had been David, or if I had been in David's shoes, I would totally have been convinced that this entire family is off its rockers because what? And if you thought that these events so far of the movie is wild, it gets worse because when Trudy's brother and sister show up, they too buy into the whole Nick likes to pretend he's been kidnapped bullshit and also laugh in response. The sanest person in this entire family happens to be the grandmother who, like she's fond of telling everyone, was on Broadway once. Dolores' goal in this film is to get the hell out of Dodge and away from her family, and considering everything that was happening, I could totally relate with Grams. Also, not only was the Chandler family cabin in the middle of bumfuck nowhere, but they also had this weird thing where they have a no cell phones rule. So even though David keeps trying to get his hands on a phone so he can call for aid, he's unable to do so. When he finds Trudy on a call and her phone is within reach, she smashes it with a meat tenderizer so he cannot call for help. I swear, this woman is local. And then when Trudy's mother, Catherine, discovers that she's run out of extra virgin olive oil, David offers to drive to go get it. And although Trudy tries to prevent it because that's the one time since she kidnapped him that he would have access to a car key and can drive away, Catherine insists on David being the one to go pick up the olive oil, but she also makes her husband, Trudy's father, Richard, go along with him. They get to the place where they are to shop, and it ends up being the gas station that Trudy had stopped by for gas when they were headed for the cabin. Unfortunately, David's cries for help doesn't work on the manager slash owner, who is still convinced that it's all some kinky play that David has going on with Trudy. Although when he sees Richard's hand on David's shoulders, he immediately believes that David is also having some sort of affair with Richard. And so when David tries being forceful in requesting for a phone so he can make a phone call, This dumbass pulls a rifle on him. I swear, this movie makes zero sense. And to continue with its utterly nonsensical streak, whilst they're on their way back to the cabin, David grabs the steering wheel to try and cause an accident so that he can flee in the aftermath. But Richard regains control of the car and promises to not say a word to anybody because he understands how exhausting relationships can be. And I'm not even in the world of this film, and I was already exhausted. Luckily for David, he finally manages to borrow Trudy's brother Jake's phone and locks himself in the guest bathroom to make a call to his girlfriend, who at first refuses to listen to him or believe him about the kidnapping until he tells her that he really was kidnapped and he was planning on proposing to her that day. Now, upon hearing that, her eyes light up and she immediately tells him that, of course, she's going to go report to the police. By this time, Trudy is just about almost succeeded in breaking the lock on the bathroom door. But a happy David opens it first, and when she confirms that he has a phone in his hand, she flushes it down the toilet and demands that he tell her who he was calling. And nah, whoever wrote this film has to hate women, like legit hates women. There is no other way to explain the mess that is this film and the absolute lack of intelligence. Like, David, who now knows that help will soon be on its way, decides that it would make it his mission to make Trudy miserable. Now, what is his plan, you ask? Simple. He's going to do everything to paint himself as the absolute best boyfriend ever, so that when the cops come over and bust Trudy's kidnapping ass, it would show her family just how bonkers she truly is. Does this film make any sense to me? No. And it continues to get more nonsensical because David sets out to do just that. Except now we get instances to show that Trudy really is the black sheep of her family who is battling with the disappointment she believes she's meted out on a constant basis to her parents because her life isn't turning out the way in which they want it to for her. And to make matters worse, it becomes clear that her family clearly likes David more than they like her. David, meanwhile, starts to soften towards Trudy, and they have moments where he even starts to have heartfelt connection with her, where they skate together, or rather, she keeps landing on her ass, and David is clearly better at it than she is. But we are meant to read it as a bonding moment. David also finds her at Sketchpad slash journal and is wowed at her skill as an artist, so that when it is time to unbox Christmas presents and Trudy's dad once again goes on a tirade about when she's going to learn to let go of her childish dreams of being an artist and just get a real job, David is the only one who speaks up for her and her work as an artist. Afterwards, he then rigs up the rink with lights and asks Trudy to skate for him, as the last time she was meant to make a presentation for school, her family didn't support her. Now though, everywhere is magical and David's eyes are tracing her every movement, and we are meant to swoon as it's to indicate that he's falling for her. But instead, I kept screaming, "What in the bullshit is this?" into my pillow. Well, Christmas dinner comes around for the Chandlers, and that is when shit hits the fan as we get confessions coming out of the wazoo. Trudy's mother is dissatisfied in her marriage to with Trudy's father, especially with their sex life. Trudy's sister, who is meant to be on a fast track to becoming a lawyer and is in law school, reveals that she dropped out of law school the year prior and invested her tuition money into setting up a Pilates studio, and her brother Jake comes out as gay. Whilst Trudy's father is dealing with basically all of his kids, shifting his assumptions about what he's always planned for their lives, in comes the police, having been recruited by David's girlfriend Jessica. And the truth comes out that Nick isn't Nick, he is David, a stranger that Trudy kidnapped from her place of work. Oh, and somewhere in there before Christmas dinner, whilst they were unboxing their gifts, David had proposed to Trudy with the ring that he was meant to give Jessica in order to, I don't know, make Trudy's family respect Trudy for nabbing herself such a catch. If that doesn't make any sense to you, trust me, you are in good company. Anyway, the entire Chandler family finds themselves in jail where they rightfully blame Trudy for having gone off the deep end with the kidnapping and all. But thankfully for them, David chooses to not press charges, and so they are all released. Trudy finds David waiting for her outside the jailhouse, but before either he or her can say anything, Jessica shows up and is immediately catty towards Trudy, which honestly, I do not blame her. Trudy kidnapped her boyfriend. Some time passes. Trudy sees an announcement in the newspaper that reveals that David and Jessica are getting married. And while she's reeling from that, she figures that what else did she expect and turns her attention instead to an exhibit that she's been asked to submit one of her pieces for. She asks her brother to come with her, and we see that her submitted piece is a painting that recreates recreated the magical night when she was skating and David was her audience of one. To make things better, her brother shows up with their parents and her sister, and Trudy learns that her parents are now in therapy, which meant that they are much more supportive of her and willing to work through the hurt that they have caused her all these years that they had put her and her work down, and they apologize for that. But now, things are now looking up for her. The piece that she submitted was sold, and when she leaves the exhibit, she's kidnapped. Yes, Trudy is kidnapped and brought to a high rise building by dun 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 David, who it turns out ended his engagement to Jessica because that brief moment of him being kidnapped opened his eyes to the fact that the life he is living isn't one that he wanted, and he's ready to pursue his own dreams of owning his own architecture firm slash art studio. I know those two words don't go together, but alas, this movie is bonkers. And the first art piece that is purchased, truly skating painting. So just as he knows he wants her painting in his life, is the same way that he knows he wants her in his life. And then they kiss. The end. As the credits were rolling on this film, I kept asking myself, what on earth did I just watch? If there ever was a time when I could feel my brain leaking out through my ears, it probably happened as I watched this movie. Because let me tell you, I have read dark romance. As a matter of fact, there's really no part of fandom work that I haven't at least dipped my toes in because I've always been a voracious reader. And when you couple that with my unwavering curiosity and insistent need to try everything at least once, then yes, there is a shit ton of stuff that I have read that some people might take issues to or might not be able to stomach. Thing is, I don't allow the media I consume to determine my morality, so I'm usually good. All of this to say that I have read dark romances. Kidnapping is a pretty common theme within a lot of those stories, and having the kidnapped love interest fall in love with said kidnapper is something that happens as the plot progresses in said romances. I have read a ton of books like that, and usually I just shrug it off and can turn off the part of my brain that is screaming the warning bells and just focus on what the story is about at its core. And so this meant that I had to sit with why I wasn't as big a fan of Holiday in Handcuffs when I read dark romances, no problem. Why I absolutely will not be rewatching this movie ever again in my life. And then it hit me. The rules of a dark romance and the world in which it occurs is vastly different from a Christmas slash holiday movie. The thing about genres and subgenres within the media we consume is that they up to set our expectations so that when we dive into a movie or a film or a book or a video game, we know exactly what we are signing up for and the end result that we are going to get when we hit the last page or when the credits roll. As far as subgenres is concerned, Holiday in Handcuff is not a dark romance. It's a Christmas slash holiday movie that tried to borrow the kidnapping turned Stockholm syndrome trope, albeit subverted because in the story, the person who does the kidnapping is the woman, which I know that the film most likely wants to spin as some hilarious feminist shakeup, except I cannot get over the fact that all it does is paint Trudy's character as being absolutely off her rockers and several times kooky, who is done in by her boyfriend breaking up with her, which sends her off on a bender. And sorry, I'm jumping the gun. I'll come back to this in a bit. But as I was saying, although the film did borrow the kidnapping turned Stockholm syndrome trope from dark romance and wove it into the central premise of its story, it still failed in properly executing it because I repeat, this is meant to be a Christmas holiday flick. Tonally, the two don't mix, the two don't match. Dark romances are meant to be much more darker. Christmas holiday movies are much lighter in tone. And I'm sure that the middle ground that the writers for this film arrived at was to go for a comedy route. And they might have succeeded too, because yes, I was ready for some zany shenanigans if it's meant to be a Christmas rom com. The problem for me, however, was that the comedy was too dry and not it. And I found myself cringing through most of the film. And not in a good way. The jokes didn't land. The happy moments just had me face palming so hard. And the plot was so contrived. I was crying, not tears of laughter, mind you, but just plain frustration. Because there's just something personally infuriating to me that we have David bound in the car, blindfolded, yes, but it's not like he has noise cancellation headphones or earmuffs on. And so please tell me how the gas station manager can come outside. David can obviously hear that Trudy is talking to someone, and yet he doesn't even attempt to scream or call for help. That is not hilarity. That is dumbassery. Like, we established that the reason why Trudy was able to get him out of the parking lot was because he slipped, bumped his head, fell unconscious, which is a great way to have him out of the spot without him being able to raise alarm bells or resist. But at the gas station, when she's pumping gas into her car and the owner of the place hands her pink furry handcuffs, he's not gagged and he's not saying anything. What? Also, the fact that the dude managed to toss in a bit of homophobia in there when David and Trudy's father showed up to pick up some of the olive oil, and the gas station manager assumed that David was gay or bi, and also with Trudy's father, had me side eyeing him because that made no sense and just existed to ensure that when David finally blotted out that he had been kidnapped, the man was not willing to believe him because of homophobia. Of course, it just meant that that scene reminded me that when they were headed to the lodge and David had regained consciousness, he could have easily shouted when they stopped to get gas. And God's sorry, it's a little thing, but it just really, really irritated me throughout the rest of the movie, especially because, like I mentioned earlier, it is clear that the film is trying to be subversive with the trope because often, say maybe 90% of the stories, it's often the female lead character that is being kidnapped by the love interest in these dark romances. With Holiday in Handcuffs, the reverse is the case. And I think that they most likely did it in order to lighten the tone of the film, to make it more fun and merry, whilst probably believing that changing the order of who gets kidnapped would give it a more feminist twist. I don't know. I unfortunately disagree because, firstly, Trudy is so inept in her attempted kidnapping that we are aware that the only reason why she succeeded at all is because the plot needed her to. So we could get the most forced, contrived runoff and they fell in love that we could ever get. But also, I don't know about you, but I do not find kidnappings funny. Even if it's a man that is the victim. Yes, I know the percentage is smaller, but men can also be abused. And society, as it already exists, is one that doesn't treat instances of men facing said abuse seriously. And that is what I think bled into this movie, whereby someone thought, ha ha ha, what if we write a Christmas movie about a character needing to bring a partner home for the holidays? And so she decides to kidnap this strange man at the diner, the only person in said diner who, mind you, was kind to her in the little interaction that he had when he was placing his order. So what if she kidnaps him and brings him to a family log cabin in the middle of nowhere? Wouldn't that be funny? Ha 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 ha. As I'm sure you can tell from my face, shit wasn't fun, nor is it subversive. What it was irritating as hell to me, especially because there is nothing feminist either about perpetuating the crazy woman trope with Trudy snapping after getting dumped by her piece of shit ex and immediately lashing out and pulling a gun on David to forcefully kidnap him and bring him home to her family as her fake boyfriend. Even when they were in the car, David accuses Trudy of being one of those men hating women. And I feel that it was less Trudy hating men or being outrightly out of her mind, and more that this movie at its core just simply hates women. And Trudy was just the outlet for that. There is nothing likable about her. There is nothing charming about the premise of the film. The jokes didn't land for me, and it seemed more like a film banked on the hilarity of ha 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 ha. She kidnapped this man and brought him home as a pretend boyfriend, which meant that if you didn't find the premise as it was a funny one, then you most likely wouldn't think the rest of the film itself is hilarious or remotely entertaining. So, like I said, I did not find the movie funny, but I didn't find it romantic either. So it failed on both ends of the rom-com spectrum for me because yes, whilst Melissa Joan Hart and Mario Lopez tried convincing us that they were falling in love, I did not feel that spark at all because for the longest time there was the hijinks of David needing to get the word out about his kidnapping. And sorry, part of my brain can't get over him having to call his girlfriend to head to the police station to report his kidnapping when he could have just, I don't know, called the bloody police himself. Like, the choices in this film baffles me. But just as I was saying, Holiday in Handcuffs is about 80 something minutes long, and for about 70% of that time slot, It went to David wanting to get as far away from Trudy as possible, which rightfully so. But if you're also going to sell me on him slowly falling for her, then I definitely need more to go on than the fact that they suddenly get the sub story of her feeling like an outsider within her family, which ends up being what lowers Davy's walls after he sees it in action and he finds himself speaking up for Trudy and caring about her. Now, do I think that Trudy's family were infuriating in their disregard for her, especially her parents in the scene when her father was berating her about getting her life together and becoming more serious about her future? Yes, they made her feel so small, and I was upset on her behalf. Yes, I was. But it didn't seem like such a ground changing revelation that would suddenly make David start caring for her, if not that the plot demanded that he do so. I really think that that is one of my major gripes with this film, actually. A lot of the situations and character choices in the movie did not feel organic, but instead felt like the plot was forcing its way into the situation so that things would turn out the way the story needed it to. For example, of course, Jessica, David's girlfriend, can't be a decent person within the narrative. The story sets us up to dislike her on principle when she first shows up because she's a bit rude to Trudy's colleague and friend. And we are meant to read her as stuck up, even though at that exact moment, our heroine had kidnapped Jessica's boyfriend, who had asked her over because he had plans to propose to her. Although why he chose a diner that crowded as his place of choice to make a proposal baffles me and definitely hints at how theirs wasn't a union that would last because, like, didn't he see his girlfriend? But sorry, I digress. Jessica, just because the story needs us to somewhat side with Trudy, is immediately positioned as a stock up that we shouldn't root for. And she's so one dimensional in the story that that is all she is. She's painted as this woman that we are subconsciously, as the audience, meant to believe that she doesn't deserve her gorgeous hot boyfriend. And I don't know about you, but both the way in which Trudy was written and the way in which Jessica was written just had me asking constantly, does this movie even like women? Like truly? And then there's the fact that we are meant to believe in some way that David, who has been kidnapped and forcefully brought to the Chandler family lodge/log cabin in the middle of bumfuck nowhere, is meant to play act as Trudy's boyfriend. And if you're about to ask yourself, especially for those who haven't seen the movie yet and didn't watch the synopsis part of the video, how is this kidnapped man meant to pretend to be her boyfriend at the family cabin? Just know that the movie tried pulling in the hocus pocus so that we don't have to worry about that or think about that. Like for real, she lies that it's a kink thing in their relationship, and her family laughs it off every time he tells them that he was kidnapped. I don't know any other way to describe it other than the plot relied on some magic sprinkle sprinkle because I keep reaching and exceeding the limit for my believability within this film. There's also the fact that the movie forced some last minute introspection on the audience in a bid to get us to care about some of the other characters, which just read to me like I was being manipulated to give a shit about them. And then a part of my brain reminded me of the Stockholm syndrome premise of the film. And then everything made sense that, of course, they will continue to try and manipulate and gaslight us into giving a single flying fuck. I mean, in order to force the Trudy and David are more alike than you think, we get one conversation between them where David admits that he's questioning what his plans and wants for his life are since he's had to deviate heavily from them in order to survive, which of course perfectly coincides with Judy's desire to live her life on her own terms rather than being burdened by the shackles of her parents' expectations and being forced to make certain choices in order to survive. And then we find out that the rest of her siblings have basically also been lying to their parents as well because what they all want is vastly different from what is expected of them. And whilst Holiday in Handcuffs tries to convince me to care about this, I honestly don't, because just as with David's conversation with Trudy, it all came out of left field and doesn't feel earned, which is my fundamental issue with this movie. None of it feels earned. Not its comedy, not its romance, not its attempt at trying to offer depth or layers to its characters. Everything just feels pretty bland, which is a travesty in and of itself because the one thing I refuse to accept from a Christmas/holiday movie is that word itself, bland. But anyway, these are just my thoughts. I would, as always, love to hear yours. Whether or not you agree or disagree with me, please Share them in the comments. Like this video, however, if you've watched this far and haven't done so yet, but enjoyed anything of what I had to say, share it so others can find my channel as well. Or you can check out my gaming or ASMR channels if they sound like something you might potentially be interested in. I have them both linked in the description. I will see you tomorrow with a new video. Until then, do remember, obsessing over the things you love, perfectly valid coping mechanism.